I'm unsure how to begin, but here it goes. My name is Helena McKay, and I'm 28 years old. I've lived in the same house my whole life, a small, peaceful place that always seemed unremarkable until everything I knew about it was turned upside down. I grew up in what most would call a typical family, just my mom, dad, and me. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. Now, though, it feels like a place I barely recognize, a space I sometimes wish I could leave behind. My mom was the center of everything. Her name was Meredith Hayden. She was strong, beautiful, and endlessly compassionate. I think about her every single day, even now. She worked as a nurse, always putting others first, always smiling even when life wasn't kind to her. She'd hum softly while preparing meals, filling the house with a warmth that made all worries fade away. She was the one person I could confide in, the one person I trusted completely. But last year, everything changed. My mom was diagnosed with advanced ovarian cancer, stage 4. None of us saw it coming. She had always seemed so resilient, always the one taking care of everyone else. I still remember the day she told me. Her voice wavered just a little, but she managed a smile to try to make it easier for me, as she always did. She said, "We'll get through this, Helena, together." But deep down, I knew she already understood how it would end. It all happened so quickly, too quickly. The doctors explained that the cancer had spread too far, and there wasn't much they could do beyond keeping her comfortable. The chemotherapy, countless doctors' visits, and sleepless nights at her hospital bedside all blur together now. The house that once felt so lively became oppressively quiet, weighed down by the reality of what was happening. My dad, Drew, struggled to cope. He withdrew, barely speaking, while I tried to keep things together. I became my mom's caregiver, not something I regret, but something that left me broken in ways I'm still trying to understand. The last few weeks were the most painful, watching her grow weaker day by day, hearing her whisper about how proud she was of me and how much she loved us. It was unbearable. Some nights, I'd sit in the hallway outside her room, crying quietly because I didn't want her to hear. I wanted her to believe I was strong, that I could handle everything, but I couldn't. When she passed, it felt like the life had been drained from the house. Everything stopped. Time seemed frozen, even though the clocks kept ticking. She was gone, and I didn't know who I was without her. My dad didn't know either. We were left with just each other, two people who didn't know how to communicate or grieve together. It felt like we were living in separate worlds under the same roof. I hoped that maybe, just maybe, we could figure things out, lean on each other and find some kind of solace. But I was wrong. That's when things began to shift. Small moments, things I dismissed because I didn't want to see them for what they were. I convinced myself I was imagining things, that it was just my grief distorting my perception. But grief didn't explain his words, his behavior, or the way he started looking at me. At first, it was subtle, easy to ignore, but it didn't stay that way for long. My mom had been everything to me, and after losing her, I thought all I had left was my dad. I believed we'd figure out a way to get through it together. Instead, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about the man who had raised me. Before everything changed, life at home had its own rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. My parents were immigrants. My mom, Meredith, came from Ireland, and my dad, Drew, hailed from a small Scottish town. They met while working at a factory shortly after moving to this country. Both of them had been searching for a better life, and they found that and each other. Our house was modest, but it was always full of life. My mom had a way of making everything feel special. Dinner wasn't just a meal, it was a time to share stories, laugh, and even bicker over the most trivial things. She adored traditions and wove pieces of her Irish heritage into every part of our lives. I can still hear her singing old Irish folk songs while she cooked, her way of keeping her past alive. My dad, on the other hand, was quieter. He worked long days as a carpenter, often coming home exhausted but never too tired to check the locks on the doors or fix something broken around the house. He wasn't the kind of man to say, "I love you," often, but he showed it in his own way, by repairing my bike or bringing home my favorite snacks after a long day at work. Those were his ways of showing affection. Being an only child, I spent most of my time with my parents. My mom meant everything to me. She helped me with school projects, stayed up late talking about crushes, and cheered the loudest at my soccer games. My dad was different. While he was supportive, he was distant. He wasn't someone you could open up to completely, which created a bit of a barrier between us. Life as an immigrant family was challenging. There were moments when money was tight, and I remember watching my parents stretch every dollar to ensure I had everything I needed. They made significant sacrifices to provide me with a better future. Despite the difficulties, my mom always found a way to keep us optimistic. She used to say, "Hard times don't last forever, Helena. You'll see." And I believed her. But everything changed when my mom got sick. Before that, she had been the strongest person I knew, effortlessly managing countless tasks while still finding time to make me laugh. Cancer, though, has a way of taking everything: your strength, your hope, even the light in your eyes. It took her from us gradually, piece by piece, until all we had left were memories. Looking back, I see now that she was the bond holding our family together. Without her, my dad and I became strangers under the same roof. We didn't know how to communicate or provide comfort to one another. I hoped we'd eventually figure it out, but instead, everything began to unravel. Before diving further into this, I just want to thank you for being here with me. Sharing this story isn't easy, but knowing someone is listening makes it a bit lighter to bear. If you want to hear more of my experiences or follow along as I navigate life, feel free to stay. After my mom passed, the dynamic between me and my dad, Drew, shifted. At first, I thought it was just grief, both of us trying to adjust to a life without her. The house felt too quiet, too empty. Conversations became rare, and when they happened, they felt strained, as though neither of us knew what to say. Then little things started happening, things that didn't sit right with me. Drew began making comments about women he saw on TV or in public. Initially, I brushed it off, thinking he was just trying to fill the silence. But the remarks grew more frequent and specific. "She's got legs for days, doesn't she?" he'd say while watching television. Or, "Women these days don't leave much to the imagination, huh?" I didn't know how to react. I'd either laugh nervously or steer the conversation elsewhere, hoping he'd pick up on my discomfort. He didn't. One evening, we were watching a romantic comedy, a lighthearted movie. There was a scene where the main characters shared an intimate moment, and out of nowhere, Drew asked, "Do you think that's what women really want? A guy like that?" I froze. It wasn't just the question, but the way he said it, as though he wanted to discuss something I had no interest in. "I don't know, Dad," I replied, trying to dismiss it. "It's just a movie." He nodded, but the look on his face made my stomach turn. It felt like he wanted to say more, but thankfully, he didn't. The next day, he brought it up again during dinner. "You're a woman, Helena. Don't you ever think about stuff like that? What makes a man attractive?" Completely caught off guard, I dropped my fork, my face turning red. I stammered something about not wanting to have that conversation with him. I hoped he'd stop, but instead, he laughed. "Come on, we're adults. We can talk about these things," he said. "Dad, please," I replied, my voice trembling. "That's too much information." His expression darkened, and I could see irritation flash in his eyes. He said nothing more that night, but the tension lingered. I felt like I'd done something wrong by shutting him down. As time went on, the comments didn't stop. They escalated. He'd make offhand remarks about women's bodies, relationships, and even his own frustrations. I began avoiding him whenever possible, staying late at work or retreating to my room as soon as I got home. But no matter how much distance I put between us, I couldn't shake the growing unease. Then came the day he brought up his prostate problems. We were sitting in the kitchen when he casually mentioned having difficulty urinating. At first, I thought it was just a health concern he wanted to share. But then he added, "You know, this kind of thing happens to men when they want to have sex but can't." I felt sick. I wanted to scream, to tell him to stop, but I couldn't. Instead, I stared at my plate, hoping he'd drop the subject. He didn't. "It's normal, Helena," he said. "Everyone goes through it eventually." I nodded stiffly, my heart pounding. It wasn't normal. Not this conversation, not the way he looked at me. That night, I sat in my room, replaying everything in my head. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, that he didn't mean anything by it. But deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong. I just didn't want to admit it. Looking back, I wish I'd spoken up sooner, trusted my instincts. At the time, though, I was too scared and confused. I told myself it was nothing, a misunderstanding, but it wasn't, and it was only going to get worse. I didn't see it coming. Maybe I should have. Perhaps there were signs I ignored or questions I should have asked earlier. But when it finally happened, it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. It started like any other day. I'd just come home from work, tired and distracted, expecting nothing unusual. But as soon as I walked in, I sensed something was different. Drew, my dad, was dressed up, not in his usual pajamas or the worn-out clothes he wore at home. He had on a neatly pressed shirt, his hair combed back, and he was cooking dinner. When he saw me, he smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile I was used to. It felt off. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his voice unusually cheerful. "How was work?" I muttered a vague response about it being fine, already feeling a growing discomfort. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way he was watching me, as if trying to gauge my mood. Or perhaps it was just a gut feeling warning me something was off. Dropping my bag near the door, I joined him in the kitchen, helping with the salad as usual. He was unusually chatty, making small talk about the weather and asking if I'd seen any good movies lately. I played along, trying to shake the uneasy feeling, but then he said something that made me freeze. "You know," he began, his tone casual but intentional. "We've been through a lot this year. Losing your mom, it's been hard on both of us." "Yeah," I said softly, not lifting my eyes from the lettuce I was chopping. "But we've managed, haven't we?" he continued. "We're still here, still standing. We're strong and open-minded." I didn't like where this was heading. My stomach tightened, and I set the knife down, turning to face him. "What are you trying to say, Dad?" He hesitated for a moment before taking a deep breath. "I've been thinking. We're both adults, and we're both lonely. Until you find someone, maybe we could be there for each other." I stared at him, initially not comprehending, or perhaps not wanting to. "Be there for each other?" I echoed, my voice trembling. "What does that mean?" He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "You know what I mean, Helena. We could keep each other company until you find a boyfriend." The room spun, and it felt like the air had been knocked out of me. "Are you serious?" I asked, my voice rising. "Have you lost your mind?" He stepped closer, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Not like that," he said hastily. "Not all the way. I just mean we could fool around, make each other feel less lonely." "Stop!" I snapped, stepping back. "Just stop. Do you even hear yourself? Do you realize how disgusting that sounds?" He flinched at my words, but his expression soon hardened. "You don't understand," he said. "It was just a thought, a fleeting thought. I didn't mean anything by it." "A fleeting thought?" I repeated, my voice shaking with anger. "You thought about it long enough to say it out loud to me. Don't tell me it was fleeting." He began pacing, running his hands through his hair. "I'm lonely, Helena," he said, his voice cracking. "Your mom's gone, and I don't know how to handle it. I have no one else. And you You're beautiful, and you're here. It just made sense. It's not like I'd stop being your dad. I felt nauseous. Do you even hear yourself? I yelled. You're supposed to protect me, to be my father, not this. I can't believe you'd even think something like this, let alone say it. He stopped pacing and turned to me, his face crumbling. I didn't mean it like that, he whispered. It's not me. It's the devil talking. I don't see you like that. You're my daughter. Then why the hell would you say it? I shouted. Why would you even let the thought cross your mind? Do you realize what you've done? You've destroyed everything, everything. He kept trying to justify himself, blaming loneliness, grief, even a movie we'd watched months ago where a father had done something similar to his daughter. He claimed it had planted the idea in his head, insisting it wasn't really him. But no matter what excuse he gave, I wasn't buying it. I screamed at him for hours, letting out every ounce of anger, fear, and disgust I'd kept bottled up. At some point, I told him he was sick and needed professional help. He didn't argue, he just stood there, repeatedly saying, "You're right, I'm sorry." But his words felt hollow, meaningless. By the time I finished, my throat was raw, my hands trembled, and I felt utterly empty. He looked shattered, but I didn't care. He'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and no matter how much he begged me to move past it, I knew I never would. That night, I locked myself in my room, pushing a chair under the doorknob because I no longer trusted him. I didn't trust anything anymore. For the first time in my life, I felt completely and utterly alone. The music shifts to a low, somber tone as Helena's voice grows quieter and more introspective. That night, I locked myself in my room, wedging a chair under the door handle, something I hadn't done since childhood, when I feared monsters in the dark. But this time, the monster wasn't imaginary. It was real on the other side of the door, and it wore my father's face. I sat on my bed, hugging my knees to my chest, trying to process what had just happened. My mind raced, replaying his words over and over. We're adults. We're smart. We could just fool around. It didn't feel real. It felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I stared at the walls of my room, the same walls I'd grown up with, but they suddenly felt alien, as though I no longer belonged here. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do something, anything, but I couldn't. I felt frozen, trapped in a suffocating silence. Every sound in the house made my heart race. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, they all made me jump. I didn't trust him anymore. I didn't trust anything anymore. At some point, I picked up my phone, my hands trembling. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but who? My mom was gone. My friends had drifted away after her death. And my dad, the one person I should have been able to rely on, was the reason I felt this way. I had no one, and yet, in that moment, I did something I still can't fully explain. I called my dad, even though he was just down the hall. I needed answers, even if I wasn't sure I was ready to hear them. He picked up immediately. "Helena," he said, his tone cautious, almost nervous. For a moment, I didn't respond, struggling to find the right words. Finally, I managed. "Why, Dad? Why would you say something like that to me?" There was a long silence, and I thought he might hang up, but then he sighed heavily. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice thick with regret. "I wasn't thinking. I've been so lonely, and it just slipped out." "That's not an excuse," I snapped, my voice shaking. "You don't just say something like that. Not to your daughter. Do you even understand how wrong that is?" "I know," he said quickly. "I know, Helena, and I'm sorry. I wasn't myself. It's not me. It's the things I've been exposed to, the things I've been watching." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my stomach twisting with dread. He hesitated before answering. "Porn. It's everywhere now. It's so easy to get caught up in it. I know it's wrong, but it's messing with my head, making me think things I'd never normally consider." I felt sick. "Are you seriously blaming porn for this?" I asked incredulously. "Do you hear how ridiculous that sounds?" "I'm not blaming it," he said defensively. "I'm just saying it's part of the problem. It's not who I am, Helena. I've been struggling, and I don't know how to deal with it." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to hang up, to shut him out completely. But another part, the part that still saw him as my dad, wanted to believe him, to trust that he wasn't this person he was showing me. But how could I? How could I trust anything he said after what he'd done? "I can't do this," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I can't live like this, Dad. I can't look at you the same way anymore." "Helena, please," he begged, his voice desperate. "I'll get help. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Just don't give up on me." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I ended the call and threw my phone onto the bed, burying my face in my hands. The tears came, hot and relentless, as the weight of everything crashed down on me. How had it come to this? How had the man who was supposed to protect and guide me become the one I feared most? I felt trapped, trapped in this house, in this life, with no escape. I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. And the worst part? I still needed him. As much as I hated him in that moment, I still relied on him for a roof over my head, for some semblance of stability, for the last fragment of family I had. That realization hurt almost as much as what he'd done. I wish I could tell you things got better after that I found the strength to leave and never look back. But the truth is, it only became harder. I wish I had all the answers. I wish I could sit here and tell you exactly what to do if you're ever in a situation like this. But the reality is, I'm still figuring it out. I'm still trying to piece together what comes next. And honestly, it's terrifying. For days after that night, I barely left my room. Every time I heard my dad's footsteps, I froze. His words replayed in my head on an endless loop, and no matter how much I thought about it, there was no way to make sense of it, no way to justify what he'd said. I knew I couldn't stay there, not like that. So I started making a plan. It wasn't easy, and it's still not, but I knew I couldn't let this define me. I couldn't let it destroy me. The first step was reaching out for help, even though it felt impossible. I contacted a therapist, someone who could help me untangle the chaos in my head and figure out what to do next. Admitting I couldn't handle this alone was hard, but it was the best choice I've made so far. Next, I began looking for a way to leave the house. It's not going to happen overnight, and I know that. I need to save money, figure out where to go, and plan how to move without causing a scene. It's overwhelming, and some days it feels like too much, but I'm taking it one step at a time. That's all I can do. What I've learned through all of this is that it's okay not to have everything figured out. It's okay to feel lost, scared, and unsure. What matters is continuing to move forward, even if it's just one small step at a time. That's what I'm trying to do. Find my strength, set boundaries, and regain control of my life. If you're hearing this and going through something similar, I want you to know you're not alone. It's easy to feel stuck, like there's no way out. But there is. It might not be fast, and it won't be easy, but there's always a path forward. You deserve safety, peace, and the chance to heal. If my story can help even one person realize that, then sharing it has been worth it. Thank you for listening and for being here. Sharing this hasn't been easy, but knowing someone out there might find strength in my words makes it a little less heavy. If you think this story could help someone else, please share it. And if you want to follow along as I work to rebuild my life, feel free to subscribe. I'd love to have you with me on this journey. This isn't the end of my story. It's the start of something new. Wherever you are, I hope you find the courage to begin your own fresh chapter too.